Hey guys, it's me, Robert Timothy, MED, RPA, PI, and real SOB. I've been a prehistoric archaeologist here in San Diego for the past 15 years. I'm also an avid science educator, science communicator, science comedian, and the host of the weekly adult science comedy podcast, Science Faction. I've been asked by the Reuben H. Fleet, please answer a science question from the general public, which I'm excited to do whenever I get a chance to. This particular one comes from the San Diego Air and Space Museum in Balboa Park. What is your favorite obscure science fact? Now, this is a great question for any science nerd, especially one that hosts a weekly science podcast, because I have a million obscure science facts bouncing around in my head at any given time. But I think the one I want to talk about today is the existence of and implications of Luca. Now, I'm not talking about the bodyguard from The Godfather or that super polite Italian boy at the corner bistro that your grandmother keeps trying to set you up with. I'm referring to the last universal common ancestor, also known as Luca. It is the ancestor of all living things on the planet today. That's amazing, because it means that not only do we share an ancestor with apes, which we probably already know, and mammals, which we probably already know, but everything, all the way down from lizards to mosquitoes to pine trees and E. coli bacteria. Basically, if you go back far enough, Maury Povich is yelling, "You're the father," at Luca for everything. It's really amazing because it means that in this hippy-dippy freshman philosophy course sort of way, we're all related, man. Like, we're all family. We're all one. We all descend from this one thing that was around 4 billion years ago that somehow managed to survive. And each one of us within us is carrying that 4 billion year old legacy. And if we have kids, we're passing that on so it will perpetuate in the future. So what I think is super interesting is that we are one chapter in this amazing story that we call biology, from abiogenesis to Luca to all living things on Earth right now to the future of life on Earth. All of that is one story which we get to play a part in, and we're all descended from that one story writer that we call Luca.
Hey there, I'm Ashley Geminate, an assistant teaching professor in neurobiology at UC San Diego. The question was, what goes on in our brain when we see contour and depth illusions? I'm a huge fan of optical illusions, so I love this question. So to understand both of these illusions, we need to confront the fact that the brain does more than actually passively take in the visual world. The brain's constantly working with patterns it's seen to build an internal model. And this is what makes visual illusions so great. They're actually fooling these internal models. Let's first consider contour illusions. A contour illusion is when you see an edge or surface that doesn't exist. You're probably familiar with one of these, the Canizza triangle, named after Gaetano Canizza, an Italian psychologist who did a lot of work on these types of illusions. One of the main challenges for our visual system is to figure out where object boundaries are. So where does one object end and the background begin? With contour illusions, it's likely that the brain is attempting to solve this problem in a way that makes sense from prior experience by grouping the edges into complete objects. This actually happens in a few areas of our visual cortex towards the back of the brain. Vision's a step-by-step process, so primary visual areas first help recognize the orientation of lines, and subsequent higher order areas build these lines into shapes and ultimately very complex objects like faces. Many researchers have actually used these contour illusions to try to understand the steps of visual processing. For example, in 2007, researchers at NYU put folks in an fMRI scanner to see how their brains actually responded to illusory contours. So they found that many different visual areas, especially the higher order ones, were involved in making sense of these illusions. More recent studies suggest that those higher visual areas are sending feedback to primary areas, as if to say, wait a second, the object looks like this. So it's likely that much of your visual cortex is involved in making sense of these illusions. One thing you'll also notice about these illusions is that the illusory shape, the one created by the contours, often actually appears to be on top of the other shapes, as if it's superimposed. Which brings us to the second topic, depth illusions. Our brain determines the depth of objects with a few different cues: relative size, occlusion, like whether one object is on top of another, distance, disparity between two eyes, and shadows. Many depth illusions actually work by manipulating one of those things in order to trick our visual system into misunderstanding the depth of a scene. So take the Ponzo illusion, for example, created by another Italian psychologist, Mario Ponzo. Typically, when we see these converging lines, like in a railroad, that means there's some depth in the scene. The railroad is trailing off into the distance. So our internal model says converging lines mean depth. And if something is further away but looks about the same size, that implies that the object itself must actually be bigger. So that's why the top line looks much longer. Our brain is misinterpreting the depth, which leads to incorrect assumptions about object size. Many researchers have studied this phenomenon in the lab as well. For example, a 2014 study from UW found that single neurons in primary visual cortex actually change their activity based on depth cues. Like the contour illusion, this is likely thanks to some feedback from higher visual areas. So there you have it. Optical illusions are fun, plus they're a great way to understand how vision works.
Hi, I'm Adam Cooper. I'm a chemistry PhD student at the University of California, San Diego, up in La Jolla. I'd like to say thanks to the folks at the Air and Space Museum for this great question about our favorite mistake we've ever made in science, which is a big part of the scientific process. So this is a story from when I was an undergraduate research intern at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. I was to spend the summer in Eldoret, Kenya, testing out a new low-cost method for determining the quality of antibiotic medicine. Now, I'm not only a scientist, but I'm a really bad packer. So first I packed all of my personal belongings and I forgot a jacket, because it was summer in Indiana, but it was winter in Kenya. Then I packed up my scientific equipment and I forgot my volumetric flask. This is a big deal. The first step of our method was to dissolve suspected low-quality antibiotics in a known amount of water. So in the lab, we try to make things as precise as possible, and the best method for that was this flask. But in the field, sometimes we need to make quick adjustments on the fly. I made a big mistake in forgetting that flask, but I had to come up with a solution. I was looking down at my plastic water bottle one day when I noticed something. It said 500 milliliters on that. That's the same volume as my flask. I ran a few quality control experiments and found out that using the water bottle to measure out the liquid worked just as good as using that $20 flask. Along the way, I also discovered that using tap water works just as good as the pricier deionized water we used to use. And so because I was a bad packer, I was motivated to innovate, I learned some new things, and I got the cost of the test down so that with the same amount of funding, we could test more antibiotics. And so I always look out for mistakes I make along the way in my current research because they can lead to some of the best innovations.